The rain had stopped, but the cold hadn't left the concrete. Under a flickering shelter light, a young woman slept hunched over a thin blanket, one cheek bruised purple and blue. When a stranger paused to give her a paper cup of coffee, she flinched like the sound would break her, but instead of taking the cup, she pushed him away with a whisper, "Please don't make me talk." He left the cup anyway, walked to the end of the platform, and watched as she curled around a memory he could not see. That night, he followed a decision he could not explain, and what he learned in the days that followed would change both of their lives forever. Rahim never meant to be a hero. He meant to catch the 9:20 bus home after a 12-hour shift at the hospital pharmacy, to warm his hands on a cup and scroll through messages from his sister. He had been tired, and ordinary kindness had become a small medicine, a coin tossed into a stranger's hunger, a blanket given to a man who smelled of diesel. The city taught him that the smallest things sometimes held the largest failure of society, but also its quietest hopes. When he saw her, at first he thought she was a child. She could have been 20, maybe 22. The rain had left tracks on her face that made the bruise look darker, almost like an accusation stamped into her skin. Her hair fell in an untidy curtain. Her clothes were layered wrong, a dress over a sweater too small, a jacket that had seen better winters. The cup he had already bought for himself felt suddenly too warm to hold. "Excuse me," he said softly, and for a second she did not move. Her breathing was shallow. He offered the coffee before he noticed anything else. Perhaps it was the simple routine of offering that pushed him forward, perhaps it was the small voice that said, "No one should sleep like this when you have hands to hold a cup." She opened one eye. The pupil was red, the whites a little bloodshot, and when she looked at him, there was a flicker of calculation, the kind you use when you weigh threat and possibility. "I don't want trouble," she said. Her voice was a rasp of gravel. "You won't get it from me," Rahim answered. His accent softened toward warmth. "It's only coffee." She accepted the cup with both hands, like something fragile and also vital. He stayed for a moment, because leaving felt like abandonment and staying felt oddly dangerous to him, he did not know why. "Name?" he asked, because there are only two ways to make someone human to you, listen, or speak their name aloud. She hesitated. "Alia." "Alia," he repeated. "I'm Rahim." She nodded, took a sip, and the steam fogged the shelter light for a second, making them both halves of the same small world. "Thank you," she said. She tried a smile and it cracked at the corner. "You're hurt," he said, because some things required the bluntness of medicine. "Are you okay? You need a hospital." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You don't understand. Hospitals are for people who know what to show. I have no papers, no money. What do I show them? Who do I say did this? They'll ask questions I don't have answers for." Rahim listened. He had seen this in patients, the technical, cold logic of systems that made help conditional. He had also seen fear knit with shame into an armor that was sometimes harder to remove than the wounds. He could hear the memory of hands and words behind her voice, he could see an invisible ledger of reasons not to trust. "Are you safe tonight?" he asked directly. "No," she admitted. "But safer than at home." That small admission hung between them like a scaffold. Rahim wanted to ask the obvious stolid question, "Why did you go back?" But he recognized the trap in that. People who stay with violence do not need their choices judged so much as their survival strategies understood. He left and then sat on the opposite bench. He called a friend who knew shelters, then another who worked evenings at a women's charity, and finally his sister, who said what sisters sometimes say, "Bring her home if you think you can." Rahim knew his apartment was not a sanctuary, a cramped studio with a single bed and a fridge that rattled like it had memories, but it was dry and it had a lock. He could not explain to himself why he decided to cycle between thefts of good sense and courage, but he did. He brought a second cup of hot tea and wrapped a spare blanket around his arm. Alia slept again. He watched her eyelids until the light in the shelter hummed lower and the city breathed. When she woke, she was guarded, as if trust were a currency she could not afford. "Come with me," he said. "Just for tonight." She frowned. "Why would you do that?" "Because I woke with a cup of coffee that saved nothing and a heart that wanted to try. Because I might be wrong, but if I'm right, the worst that happens is you say no tomorrow." He tried to make his voice sound braver than he felt. She studied him. There was a world of reason stacked in her eyes to refuse, but also a tiny, tired hope that perhaps someone would not ask for explanation, only for presence. "I'll come," she said finally. On their way to his apartment, Alia's story unspooled in fragments: a marriage that had promised shelter and instead delivered rage, a husband who drank to silence himself and then used his fists to speak, a first night when a hand had closed over her throat and she had decided that survival sometimes meant leaving with nothing but her skin. She spoke of a daughter, a small, bright thing named Noor, and said the name like prayer. She had tried police once. The paperwork had felt like a foreign language. The officers had looked bored. Her husband had promised retribution if she spoke. She had fled, thinking the city would be a new map where she could hide. But the city has a way of shrinking and sometimes the map folds you inside pockets. Where there is no room to breathe. Rahim listened and did not badger. When a woman speaks about a child in the hush of a borrowed couch, the room tilts to that axis, everything else rearranges itself around the child's name. He asked, gently, about Noor. "Where is she?" "In my sister's care, for now," Alia said. "My sister is ill. She asked me to go because she couldn't risk her husband finding us both." Rahim looked at her and saw not only bruises but the rawness of a woman carrying a secret that smelled like danger. He promised, not to solve everything, he refused that hubris, but to help her take one right step. They slept in the same small apartment on two separate mats, like companions of war who owed the world nothing more than the chance to wake. The next morning, Rahim made a call to an old colleague, Fatima, who ran a legal helpline for women with domestic abuse claims. Fatima listened to Alia's story with a professional tenderness that made Rahim admire her. "We can get an emergency protection order," she said. "We can file without money, and will help with temporary shelter and documents. But we must be careful, we need evidence." Alia's eyes hardened at the word evidence. Evidence means papers. Papers mean being traced. She had once tried to erase those traces. "I can't risk Noor." Fatima spoke softly, "There are ways. A child's safety is the center." For the first time in months, perhaps, Alia let herself imagine a world with processes that might protect rather than punish. Rahim found himself inside a bureaucracy he did not love and learning its language: forms, signatures, affidavits. He sat with Alia as she recited dates, times, small humiliations and larger injuries, as if telling a list might make the truth more real. Sometimes she would stop and stare, as if the telling itself opened the wound wider. Rahim brought chai and sandwiches and quiet presents. The more he listened, the more he realized he was not trying to rescue something broken, he was witnessing a woman rebuilding herself, brick by tender brick. But resilience is not a linear arc. The ex-husband found their thread. He called on a wrong number and discovered Rahim's phone where Alia had slipped it to check messages. The man's voice on the line was thick with the kind of ownership that had nothing to do with love. "You left my place," he said. "Tell her to come back, or I'll take Noor." Alia went pale, and for a moment her breath stopped. Rahim felt anger like a hot wind. He wanted to go find the man, to teach him something about consequences, but he knew the law was the way this had to be handled. They called Fatima. A protection order was rushed through, shelter placements were arranged for Noor and for Alia. But bureaucracy moves in a rhythm where sometimes danger arrives before the papers do. There was a night when the ex-husband came to the shelter where they had first tried to register Alia. He banged on the door like thunder. He asked questions of the staff. He threatened. The staff called the police, who arrived with the tired authority of a system stretched thin. They took statements. They left. The man drove away, but his taillights were a long thread of threat rolling into the dusk, reminding them that legal shields are paper in the face of rage. Alia began to cry then, not the small, private tears, but a currency of grief released. She whispered, "I thought if I ran I could outrun the fear. But fear has legs." Rahim sat beside her and took her hand, careful not to frighten her further. "You're not alone," he said. For all his good intentions, Rahim had not expected the way his life would entangle. He had not expected to start caring about childcare pickup times, or to learn the delicate choreography of supporting someone who was learning to trust again. He had not expected the way his coffee offering impulse would bloom into something that felt like purpose. The protection order arrived stamped and official like a small, fragile miracle. For a while, it worked. Alia was moved to a safe house, Noor stayed with her aunt under the watch of the charity. Rahim volunteered to help coordinate phone calls, message updates, and once, to stand outside a courtroom until the lids of his eyes felt heavy. They went to court for a hearing where the judge listened with a patience that felt holy. The ex-husband's threats were catalogued. The judge signed papers with the weight of law, and the man was ordered to remain away. But legal wins do not immediately fix hunger, bureaucratic snafus, or the daily economy of fear. Alia had to rebuild identification, to find work that could be flexible and safe. Her confidence had been taken, and it had to be grown back, not by decree but by labor. She took small jobs. Cleaning at a school, washing dishes at a diner at night, and Rahim brought food sometimes and tapes of recorded lullabies she could play so Noor would hear a voice even when distance held them apart. There was a day when Noor came to visit under supervised terms. Rahim drove Alia to the meeting point and waited in the car like a nervous guardian. When Noor ran toward her, all of Alia's rehearsed caution melted, her face lit up in a way that made Rahim feel he had been handed something sacred. The reunion was loud and messy and perfect. Noor's small arms wrapped around Alia's neck and for a minute the world did not notice anything else. In these months, the community shifted around them. Neighbors who once looked away began bringing clothes and toys. A teacher at Noor's school offered to help with tutoring. Fatima's legal team stayed until the last paper was signed. The web of strangers became a scaffold. Rahim learned that sometimes redemption is not dramatic. It is the steady attendance of people who decide to stay. Yet the tension never quite left. The ex-husband violated the order once, a single text message that read like a shadow. "You think you can hide," it said. "I will find you." That message unstitched something in Alia. She shut herself in her room for days, phone turned off, refusing even the light of the screen. Rahim drove to her, knocked, and waited on the stoop because presence, again, felt like the only antidote. "Go to the police," he said. "They can arrest him for harassment." "I don't want Noor to see him in handcuffs," she said. "It will scar her." "You can't let him decide that for you," Rahim answered. "You have a right to safety." The moral calculus of protecting a child from trauma while also protecting a mother from escalation is a tangle that has no simple solution. They chose to go together. Fatima filed a harassment complaint. The police acted, and for the first time the man felt the net tighten. He was fined, and a warrant was issued if he came near. Things shifted, but not cleanly. Months passed and Alia found work at a sewing cooperative that taught survivors to stitch and sell handmade garments. Her hands, once clumsy with fear, learned the patient geometry of thread and needle. Sewing became therapy and trade, and each finished garment was an affirmation, "I made this." She began teaching other women how to sew, and the small circle of women stitched themselves into a community of mutual aid. Noor learned to call Rahim Uncle Rahim, as if the title carried a different sort of safety. He noticed that the word made a small smile appear at the corners of his days. One evening, the shelter where Alia had once slept announced a fundraiser to support the cooperative. Rahim was there with a tray of samosas and a tired smile. The room hummed with conversation. A local journalist, covering the event, asked to interview Alia. She paused, then answered the questions with a courage that did not boast but simply stated fact. I left because fear was louder than the love he promised. I stayed away because love must not be a bruise. The article that ran next week did more than describe a woman's pain. It framed the cooperative as a model of recovery. Orders came in for garments. A donor sent funding to expand the space. Suddenly, the fragile repaired into possibility. Alia's story threaded into a larger tapestry where personal survival became public movement. And then, the unthinkable, a letter arrived from the ex-husband. It was not a threat this time. It was an apology, clumsy and disbelieving, filled with qualifiers and defensiveness. He wrote that he had been arrested, taken to anger management, and had started counseling. He asked for forgiveness and for a chance to change. The offer was a grenade wrapped in a bow. Alia read the letter twice. She burned it afterward in a metal bucket in the cooperative's courtyard, watching the smoke lift like an offering. She had no magic to undo what had been done. Forgiveness, she decided, was a private thing and not a public obligation. She could forgive without accepting him back, she could forgive so that anger did not become the framework of her child's world. Rahim watched and did not judge the small ceremonial fire. Time, dedication, and the scaffolding of community healed some wounds. Alia's bruise faded, its color becoming a pale echo. She learned to sleep without the posture of someone ready to curl away from a fist. Noor grew into a bright child who liked making paper boats and insisted on calling Rahim when she saw buses with lights that blinked like fireflies. Rahim's life had become richer, less about routine and more about unexpected tenderness. He started volunteering more, at the cooperative, the shelter, and at a helpline where he learned to listen without trying to fix everything, a kind of humility that was its own strength. A year after the coffee in the shelter, the cooperative hosted a small fashion show. The room filled with neighbors, funders, and people who had once been strangers. Garments flowed down a makeshift runway, stitched with stories in the seams. Alia stepped forward, and Noor walked beside her, small and proud. When the crowd applauded, Alia felt a wave of something she had never allowed herself to feel before, not triumph in the old sense, but quiet ownership of a life remade. At the end of the evening, Rahim found a moment to speak to her alone. "You did the bravest thing," he said. She looked at him, and there was no melodrama in her answer, only a steady truth. "I did the only thing I could do. I protected Noor. I kept going." She smiled, small and fierce. "And you gave me coffee." Rahim laughed. "That must be the most effective intervention in history." They both knew it was not the coffee alone. It had been the refusal to turn away, the small decision to remain, the network of people who kept coming back. It was the legal help and the shelter, the stitches and the nights when someone sat and listened. Life was made of small acts, not grand gestures. The story came alive in the everyday. The inspiring truth that stayed with those who knew the story was simple and stubborn: kindness begins as a small thing, a cup, a call, a shelter, but it can become a life raft. Most importantly, the cost of inaction is high. One person's decision to act had kept a child in a classroom and a mother at a sewing machine, it had stopped a cycle from continuing in silence. In the final scene, Rahim stood at the back of the cooperative's new workshop, now painted bright, filled with humming machines, and watched Alia showing a young woman how to bind a hem. Noor chased a paper boat across the floor and then brought it back, placing it in Rahim's hand like an offering. He felt something warm in his chest, not the pride of savior, but the quiet joy of being present. Alia caught his eye and nodded toward the open door where the city waited. She said nothing and everything, "Keep the door open." Rahim understood. He had opened it that night with a cup of coffee. He had no idea how far the ripple would reach. He had only known this: when you see someone sleeping in a shelter with a blanket, sometimes the right response is simple: bring warmth, bring presence, and when you can, walk beside them. The rest is work, and community, and time. And in that small, humming workshop, with the machines like steady heartbeats, with Noor's laughter, with the women stitching futures into fabric, the story ended not with closure but with continuity. They were not a singular miracle, they were a proof that ordinary people, choosing to act, could tilt a life toward light. The last line is not a moral lecture but an invitation: when the world offers you a chance to hand someone a cup, take it. You might be giving them more than warmth, you could be starting their way home.